A father with one leg was mocked and dismissed as broken, until the day his 12-year-old daughter was taken by men hiding in the mountains. Their leader, Cal Henderson, turned his bitterness into cruelty, using a child to strike at the town that he blamed for his fall. But Jack Collins had a hidden strength, forged in silence and pain, and he set out to run 100 miles alone to bring her back. And just wait until you hear how this impossible journey ended, because justice, against every expectation, did not stay silent. On the edge of a wind-brushed Wyoming town lived Jack Collins, a former rodeo cowboy whose name once rolled from the loudspeakers like thunder. Years later, the arena boards were gray, his buckles slept in a shoebox, and folks remembered him in two opposing ways. Some as a legend gone quiet, others as a man life had pressed flat. A ranch accident had taken his right leg at the knee. Since then, he moved with a carbon fiber prosthesis that tapped the sidewalk like a patient metronome. The sound drew looks. In that town, a look could be kinder than words, and many were, yet a few landed like pebbles flicked at a window. The regulars at the North Star Bar let their jokes ride the room. A one-legged cowboy is good for a scarecrow, they said, or a weather vane. The lines were easy to say, and the room liked easy. Jack heard them in passing and felt his jaw set, then loosen. He had learned to weigh every response against what it might cost his daughter. Lily was 12, all quick questions and running shoes, a pair of bright eyes that could quiet storm wind. For her, he saved his strength because since his wife June passed, the house had become a bridge he built each day, plank by plank. He kept the kitchen stocked with pancake mix and oranges, kept a small notebook of Lily's track times and spelling lists, kept the habit of laying out her backpack by the door so mornings never started in a rush. He rarely answered back, not for lack of words, but because he carried them like live coals and feared what might burn if he threw them. He lived for his 12-year-old daughter, Lily, the bright center of a small rented house that smelled of coffee, rain-damp denim, and saddle soap. After his wife, June, passed, the place turned into a workshop of careful routines. Breakfasts on the porch, homework at the table, a row of shoes by the door, his prosthesis leaning on a chair like a tall, patient tool. Work came in fragments. He fixed fence lines and tuned saddles, stretched each paycheck, and learned to run again along the river road at dawn, letting the cold air stitch his lungs while gravel hummed through carbon and socket. Pain visited, but it did not get a spare key. He had a rule, no complaints within Lily's earshot. If she asked, he told her the leg was just a different kind of boot. She would laugh and race him to the cottonwoods, and he would let her win by a step. That evening, the sky went watercolor over the grain silos. Jack left the grocery with flour and a jar of honey tucked against his ribs. Two teens lounged by the newspaper rack, bored, eager to make a memory that would ring loud in a group chat. They watched the measured swing of his gait, and one boy began to mimic it, dragging a sneaker and snapping his fingers in a crooked rhythm. The other clapped and laughed, not with surprise, but with the practiced tone of someone performing for a camera that wasn't there. Then the line came, sharp and public, a sentence meant to stick. "Hey, Jack, better stay home. You've got one leg. You won't even make it to a horse." The words bounced off glass and brick and landed like a thrown stone in his chest. Jack did not stop. He set his jaw, adjusted the sack, and kept his eyes on the far hills where evening lay like a blue shawl. Behind him, the doorbell gave a single hard ring as it closed. Laughter thinned with distance. Outwardly, he was calm. Inwardly, a match rolled across dry grass. He told himself the boys were just noise. He had spelling words to quiz Lily on, a skillet to season, a fence to check before the next cold snap. Yet the sentence kept looping, a rope circling in an empty arena. In the rearview mirror, he caught a face he barely knew. Older, yes, and also caged. He feared a lesson Lily did not deserve, the one the world sometimes teaches too fast, that people can be careless with what they do not understand. He breathed slow, counted to 5, and kept the truck between the white lines. Gravel knocked the wheel wells as he turned onto their road. Porch light pooled on the steps like warm water. Inside, Lily sat with a pencil tucked behind her ear, hair in a loose braid, a question already in her eyes. He opened his mouth and chose something simple. They baked biscuits, drizzled honey, practiced vocabulary, and made a plan for the weekend. Library in the morning, then a hike to the ridge if weather held. He listened to her chatter and felt the ember cool to a manageable glow. Later, in the quiet after lights out, he stood in the doorway and watched her sleep. The house ticked. Wind lifted the curtains a finger's width as if the night were taking a careful breath. A few days later, the calm rhythm of the small Wyoming town shattered with news no one expected. Word spread quickly across diners, gas stations, and front porches. A group of men hiding out in the mountains had taken Lily Collins. The leader of this band was Cal Henderson, once a respected farmer who had lost everything when the bank repossessed his land. Years of watching strangers plow the soil he once called his own hardened him until resentment became his only companion. In his bitterness, he convinced himself the town was his enemy, and to make it pay, he chose the cruelest weapon possible, its children. For Cal, snatching Lily was not simply a crime, it was revenge against neighbors who, in his mind, had stood by while his life crumbled. When Jack's phone rang that evening, the unfamiliar number froze the air around him. He answered with a strained hello, and the voice on the other end was coarse, commanding without mercy. The warning was short. If Jack interfered, Lily would disappear forever. No room for negotiation, no space for fatherly pleading. Just a promise that his little girl's life balanced on silence and obedience. The line went dead, leaving only the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Jack's hand slipped, the phone clattering against the tiles. He sank to his knees as if the weight of the whole room had pressed him down. Grief tore through him, rawer than the night his wife had passed, and his chest heaved with the kind of cries he thought he had already spent a lifetime giving. The thought of Lily alone, frightened in the cold shadows of the mountain, was unbearable. He pressed his palms against the floor, whispering her name as though she could hear it. In his mind, a single truth screamed back. He was broken, a man missing half of what he needed, someone who could not run 10 miles, let alone cross the harsh trails where the outlaws hid. Word of the kidnapping spread, and soon the town's small circle of neighbors gathered. They hovered by his porch, by the gas station, even by the sheriff's office. Their faces carried pity, their words a soft cushion that only deepened the cut. Some patted his shoulder with the hollow comfort of those who didn't believe he had a chance. One woman shook her head and said she'd pray, as though that was the most anyone could do. Others muttered that they hoped the sheriff's deputies could negotiate something, but behind their voices lay the assumption that Jack Collins would play no part in saving his child. To them, he was a father out of the fight before it began. Even the sheriff, a man Jack had once ridden fence with in younger days, spoke to him gently but with finality. "We're doing everything we can, Jack, but you're not that cowboy anymore. Let us handle this." The words landed heavier than a slammed door. In them, Jack heard not just doubt, but dismissal, the verdict that his role was only to wait, powerless, as others carried the burden. The sentence cut deeper than the laughter of the barroom regulars ever had. That night, the town carried on with its hushed conversations and restless sleep, while Jack remained in his kitchen, staring at the empty chair where Lily's backpack usually rested. He gripped its wooden back as though the grain could anchor him to something steady. The silence pressed against him, and the sheriff's words echoed, "You are not a hero anymore." He closed his eyes and felt the sting of being seen as less than a father, less than a man, less than someone who could change the course of this night. Yet under the weight of that judgment, another ember stirred, faint and fragile, but alive, the knowledge that Lily still waited for him, somewhere beyond the ridges, and she had no one else to believe in but him. That night the house lay silent except for the ticking of an old clock, but Jack could not rest. He sat on the front porch where the boards creaked faintly under his weight, his eyes fixed on the scatter of stars above the dark ridgeline. The sky stretched wide and cold, and in its quiet immensity something inside him shifted. For days he had carried despair like a stone chained to his chest, but now another voice rose up, a memory soft yet powerful. It was Lily's voice, spoken on a brighter afternoon months ago when she had slipped her hand into his and told him with the fearless conviction of a child, "Dad, you're stronger than any cowboy, even with one leg." The words returned like a spark, striking dry tinder. Jack drew a deep breath, feeling it scrape through lungs raw from grief, and stood. He limped back into the house, not to surrender to the emptiness, but to prepare. In the corner leaned his old prosthetic, scarred from years of quiet training no one in town had ever noticed. He strapped it on with steady hands. Then he pulled out a worn rucksack, filled it with water, a few strips of dried meat, and a folded map of the mountain trails he knew better than anyone. There was no hesitation left in him. He would run the 100 miles of brutal country, cross ravines, scale ridges, push through brush and shale, because no one else alive carried the same knowledge of those paths. The sheriff had doubt. The neighbors had pity. But Jack had something stronger. The memory of every fence post he had driven into that land, every trail he had cleared, every sunrise he had chased during the secret hours of training. For years when the town slept, he had risen early and tested his body, running along the ranch roads and creek beds. He did it not to prove anything to the men at the bar, but to prove to himself that he could still move forward, that he was not finished. The pain was familiar, the adjustments endless. But over time, his stride became surer, his lungs deeper, his will harder. Now that hidden work became his only weapon. He stepped into the night and began. The first 20 miles were torture. The straps of the prosthetic rubbed his skin raw until fire spread across his leg. Each incline felt like a wall designed to break him. His breath came in ragged bursts, and more than once the dark edges of fainting closed in. He stumbled, fell against rocks, pressed his forehead to the cold earth. Yet each time despair whispered, another voice cut through, the echo of Lily laughing, the lightness in her tone when she called him her hero. That memory hauled him up every time he fell. He pushed, staggered, found rhythm, lost it, then clawed it back. His body was no longer flesh and bone alone. It turned into a machine driven by a single fuel. Bring her home. Mile after mile he carved forward, night giving way to gray dawn, then to the harsh glare of noon. Birds startled from trees as he passed, and deer lifted their heads at the strange figure pounding the dirt paths. Somewhere behind him the town whispered. Word spread faster than dust on the highway. Jack Collins had set out into the mountains alone on foot. At first the voices were mocking. He's lost his mind. He'll never last a day. Old laughter tried to follow him, but the miles wore it down. As the distance grew, so did the weight of what he was doing. People who had once called him broken now found themselves checking the horizon, waiting for updates. They spoke more quietly. He's still going. He's past 20, 30, 50 miles. The disbelief began to turn slowly into awe. Even those who had jeered the loudest now tracked his progress with unease, realizing this was no act of desperation alone. It was a demonstration of a will that refused to be erased. By the time he cleared 60 miles, worn and bloodied by effort, the story of his run had reached every corner of the county. Farmers spoke of him over fence lines, mothers whispered his name at supper tables, and the same men who once dismissed him sat silent in the bar, listening for the next report. They began to understand what Lily had known all along, that Jack Collins was not finished, not broken, but rising into something larger than his past. Each step through stone and shadow pulled the legend back into life, until the man mocked as a scarecrow became a figure too relentless to ignore. The trail had carved him down to his rawest form, yet on the 90th mile Jack Collins still pressed. Forward, every step a defiance of the limits his body tried to impose. His shirt clung to him with dust and sweat. His skin beneath the straps of the prosthesis was torn and bleeding, and the weight of exhaustion pressed against his shoulders like stone. Yet his eyes were locked ahead, not on the pain but on the faint column of smoke rising between the trees. That smoke marked the place where his daughter was being held, and no wound or weakness would stop him. The clearing opened slowly, revealing the rough circle of tents and a fire crackling low. The camp had the careless look of men who believed they were untouchable. Weapons leaned against logs, boots rested beside coals, and laughter rose and fell as though the world outside the mountains could not touch them. Jack stepped into that space, not with the strength of numbers or the armor of law, but with nothing more than a knife at his belt and the resolve of a father whose purpose had burned away all fear. Cal Henderson stood at the center, his frame thick, his beard unkempt, a man who had lived too long on anger. He turned, expecting perhaps a deputy or a negotiator, but what he saw instead made his expression falter. There stood Jack, gaunt and battered, but upright, his shoulders squared against the weight of 90 miles. His very presence was a contradiction to the disbelief the town had carried for years. Cal's eyes widened, then narrowed into a mocking grin. "You can't even stand, Cowboy," he sneered, trying to reclaim his confidence with words. Jack's voice rasped through cracked lips, quiet but carrying the force of truth. "I stand for my daughter." The air tightened. For a moment, even the men by the fire hesitated, watching two figures who embodied opposite worlds, one driven by bitterness, the other by love. Cal moved first, lunging with the fury of a man determined not to be humiliated. Jack met him without hesitation. The fight was not graceful, it was raw, a collision of will and survival. Jack felt every bruise, every tearing ache, yet none of it mattered. He drove forward with the strength that came not from muscle alone, but from the endless miles of struggle behind him. The ground tore beneath their boots as they grappled, each man throwing weight against the other. Cal's fist struck, but Jack refused to fall. He used the momentum of desperation, his knife flashing only as a warning, forcing Cal onto his back. With a surge that drew the last reserves of his strength, Jack pressed him down, the blade at his throat, his breath ragged but steady. His voice was iron. "Let her go." From the edge of the camp, a small cry broke through, trembling yet fierce. "Lily!" Her eyes widened as she saw her father above the man who had taken her. The firelight caught the moment in stillness, a broken body standing unbroken, a girl's faith proven right. Cal, pinned, realized the fight was no longer his. His men faltered, none daring to move against a father who had crossed 90 miles of wilderness for a single reason. Slowly, reluctantly, the grip of threat released. Lily ran, her steps uneven, her breath hitching, until she collided with her father's chest. Jack dropped the knife, wrapping his arms around her, holding her as though the world itself had just been restored. In that instant, the night grew silent. The mountain breeze seemed to pause, and time itself held still, honoring the sight of a man who had achieved what all had called impossible. Jack Collins had reached the unreachable, endured the unbearable, and faced down the unthinkable. He had run, he had fought, and he had won. Dawn was breaking when Jack came down the main street carrying Lily in his arms. The light touched the rooftops with pale gold, and the dust lifted under his boots as though the ground itself acknowledged what he had endured. The town had gathered in silence, drawn out of homes and shops by the whisper that the impossible had happened. No fanfare greeted him, no applause rose, only a deep hush, as if words themselves had stepped aside in respect. The two boys who once mocked his uneven walk stood at the back of the crowd. Their laughter was gone. Their eyes fell to the ground, unable to meet the gaze of the man they had ridiculed. The bar regulars who had made him the subject of their cruel jokes shifted uneasily, their hands shoved deep in their pockets, the weight of shame pressing harder than any lecture could. Even the sheriff, a figure usually steady and measured, removed his hat and gave only a slow nod, his face caught between disbelief and reverence. Jack paused at the center of it all, his body trembling from the miles and the battle, but his hold on Lily steady as stone. Her small arms clung to his neck, and in a voice soft enough for him alone she whispered, "I always knew you could do it." That single sentence poured strength into him greater than all the miles behind them. It was the confirmation that nothing had been in vain, that the long nights of training in secret, the pain he had swallowed, and the humiliations he had endured had all led to this moment of truth between father and daughter. Around them, the silence shifted into recognition. Jack was no longer the one-legged cowboy limping across the grocery lot, no longer the subject of pity or mockery. He had become something greater, a symbol of resilience, of courage carved through hardship, of a love so fierce it had carried him through 100 miles of trial. People who once dismissed him now saw a man who had defied every label they tried to place on him. The town, in its quiet way, understood that it had witnessed not just the rescue of a child, but the rebirth of a legend. For those who had looked at him with contempt, the lesson cut sharp and clear. You never underestimate the power of a parent's devotion. You never dismiss the spirit of someone willing to bear every mile, every wound, every ounce of doubt for the sake of their child. As the sun rose higher, Jack walked past the crowd without fanfare, his head neither bowed nor lifted in pride. He did not need their approval. What he carried in his arms, safe and breathing against his chest, was all the triumph he would ever seek. And though the town would speak of his run for years to come, for Jack it was simple. He had done what he must. And in doing so, he had shown them all that strength is not measured by what is missing, but by what a man refuses to give up.